This is Section 8, Lecture 2. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about theoretical perspectives of our national security policy. And some of the terms and ideas that we're going to be discussing here have been mentioned in previous lectures. And here we're going to clarify them more from a theoretical perspective when it comes to national security policy. If you remember back to our earlier lectures, we discussed the grand strategies of different presidents throughout our recent history. And most of the time when we discuss this idea of grand strategies, this is going to include how our national defense policy is formulated. Our foreign policy is defined in this grand strategy, and of course, national defense policy is a large part of our foreign policy. And so, hopefully, you remember from the Truman Doctrine through the Reagan administration, our major national security policy was the containment of the Soviet Union and containing their power from the Truman administration through the Reagan administration meant to balance against the power of the next most powerful nation state, which was the Soviet Union and of course also its allies. In the Eisenhower and Kennedy administration, there were upgrades to our nuclear arsenals and expansion of our nuclear arsenals. And so the idea of deterrence, which is key to the balance of power, became elaborated in nuclear deterrence policy. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the idea of deterrence itself, and then in a different lecture, we're going to be discussing nuclear deterrence. Balance of power theory is an element of national security policy and strategic thought. Remember, balance of power theory earlier from our lectures is the idea that when two nation states are roughly equal in their military capabilities, then this should lead to security. The idea is that rational nation-state actors will recognize when they can win and when they cannot win in a conflict with other countries. And if you're roughly equal with another country, neither can dominate the other. Each nation would be weakened by war, but each nation would survive. And so you would recognize that getting into a conflict with that roughly equal nation state isn't going to get you anywhere. And the other country would recognize this as well. And so the idea of deterring that other nation from aggression is encouraged. And then also, you not being aggressive is also encouraged. And in order to keep this equality, we talked about joining alliances to balance against the power of larger and stronger nation states. And we talked about those two means of balancing power earlier in lectures. Internally, nation states can build up their militaries and expand their economies. And externally, nation states form alliances with other countries. We have also discussed power preponderance theory in earlier lectures. Power preponderance theory is seen oftentimes in opposition to the balance of power theory, but it's based on the same premises. The idea is to keep other nation states from attacking you. And one way to do that is to balance against their power. They'll recognize that they can't win. And if they recognize they can't win, then they'll be kept from attacking you. Power preponderance theory works in the same way, except that rather than being balanced against another nation state, The idea is that you should be vastly more dominant than the other nation state. And so then, if you're vastly more dominant, you don't exactly even have to be a rational actor to recognize that you can't win if you face a conflict with a country. And so then, when one side has this overwhelming and obvious military power and advantage, then other countries will be kept from attacking it. And we discussed how this idea helped to shape our national security policy beginning in the Reagan administration, and we'll go deeper into that in subsequent lectures. And still is the basis of our national security policy today to an extent, seen in our current grand strategy of sustained primacy. The United States wants to maintain this military dominance in the world. And so our military spending is that much greater than others. Our technological investments are that much greater than others, so on and so forth. Both of these ideas are fundamentally based on deterrence. Deterrence, I have here, is basically trying to prevent an attack by another country. And you can threaten that other country through saying that you're going to defend yourself. And you have to convince then that other country that you're going to stand up for yourself. Well, one way to do that is to show them that you have at least as much power as they do. That's balance of power theory. And another way to do that is to show them that you have overwhelming power. That's power preponderance theory. But both of these are aimed at deterrence, deterring another country from attacking you, convincing your opponent that the costs of attacking you are going to outweigh the benefits. And one of the theorists that we mentioned earlier in our lectures was Hans Morgenthau. And I have a quote here from one of his books when he's discussing anarchy and the idea of the balance of power. International systemic anarchy creates an environment where a nation-state's security is one of the primary concerns facing it. Nations have to anticipate the threats from other nations and perceive that if it cannot protect itself, that other nation-states will be able to overtake it. The political objective of military preparations of any kind is to deter other nation-states from using military force by making it too risky for them to do so. To make the application of military force unnecessary by inducing the prospective enemy to desist from using their military force. This is counterintuitive to a lot of people, that you would invest so much in your military and invest so much in the technology and build it up so much so that you don't have to use it. But this is the basis of deterrence, and it's the basis of the balance of power theory and power preponderance theory. You don't want it to get into a war with other countries. You don't want other countries to attack you, and so you have to be militarily powerful. And so the more militarily powerful you are, the less it will be necessary to have to use your military. The idea of deterrence is based on several factors. How do we know how another nation state is going to act? How do we know that a nation state is going to stand up for itself? How do other nation states know, if they're threatening us here in the United States, that we are going to stand up for ourselves? Well, our past behavior is one indicator. Have there been instances when your prospective enemy or the nation state that you want to attack has backed down? Well, this gives the potential challenger an insight to whether or not you're going to defend yourself or you're going to back down. This is one of the reasons that you always have to be seen as strong, and you always have to be seen as standing up for not just yourself, but your allies, to demonstrate to the rest of the world that you will not give in to their aggression or their threats. And this is what the second point in part discusses. You don't just stand up for yourself, you stand up for your allies. And these are referred to as protege countries. The more valuable a protege country, the more likely you are to stand up for it as its ally. And so then, our military alliances, particularly when it comes to relatively weaker nation states, can be considered protege countries. South Korea, Israel, so on and so forth would be considered protege countries of the United States. I mention those two because they are ones that are in most regular threat from their neighbors. The military balance is, of course, an element of the calculus of deterrence. You can protect yourself, show that you're standing up for yourself by having a balance of power or a dominance of power. And this shows then that you have the immediate or short-term ability to protect yourself from the potential aggression or invasion of another country. One of the things that has changed the calculus of deterrence and changed the notion of the balance of power and those theories is the possession of nuclear weapons. But there's still a question on whether or not a nation state will stand up for itself by using its nuclear weapons. This relies on the defender's reluctance to use nuclear weapons. Why, if you possess them and you're being attacked, would you not want to use your nuclear weapons? Well, that's because of their destructive nature. Because once they've been used, perhaps another nation state will use them on you. So, because of the highly destructive nature of nuclear weapons, the calculus of deterrence of whether or not a nation state will stand up for itself by using them sometimes comes into question. The calculus of deterrence is also based on a country's past bargaining behavior. And so then, in negotiations, in standoffs with other nation states, it has been an element of our national security policy that our deterrence should come from a firm but flexible stance, that we will always be seen to stand up for ourselves and our allies. That's the firm stance. We'll always have this large military. That's the firm stance. But when it comes to negotiations, we're willing to negotiate from this position of power and be somewhat flexible, given somewhat to the demands of other nation states. We've mentioned earlier that our current grand strategy here in the United States is referred to as sustained primacy. And so our current national security policy is all about preserving the U.S.'s dominance in the world. Our military dominance, our economic dominance. This has included using our military in places where we see potential threats. This has also included those other elements of strategic defense policy, economics, the idea that we are more economically tied with other nation states may also lead to our security in knowing that the benefits of economic exchange oftentimes will outweigh any desire of two countries to go to war with one another. And we've also maintained this policy of sustained primacy through our building and leadership in international organizations. But all of these theories, balance of power theory, power preponderance theory, and deterrence, are fundamentally based on the ideas of realism. And if you remember our theoretical aspects of realism, that was nation state to nation state politics. That doesn't take into account new threats like terrorism. And so what we see in our current national security policy is an adaptation. Beginning at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union voted itself out of existence, our military began to shrink. And through the 1990s and even into the 2000s, that number has been relatively small. Our number of troops, our number of bases around the world particularly, and the number of bases here in the United States is much smaller than it was. And that was an adaptation to our strategic environment, limiting the number of bases because the threat of the Soviet Union had been reduced. But in the face of a new threat like international terrorism, this focus on a smaller military is also influential, and this has been part of our national security policy during the War on Terror. The use of smaller units and unconventional units, the use of special forces, the use of drone strikes and missile strikes rather than so-called boots on the ground, is one of those adaptations to this new strategic environment that we find ourselves in when it comes to fighting international terrorism. Another thing that we have seen recently, the change in our national security policy, we've discussed with our chapters on bureaucracy. Getting bureaucracies to communicate with one another, to share information, to work together, and to go on and join operations with one another is a phenomenon of our national security policy. And this requires a lot of coordination and communication among our bureaucracies and among foreign agencies as well, with other nation states' bureaucracies, their militaries, their intelligence services. And so in order to work effectively and efficiently, we see then that the intelligence agencies in our nation state have been brought under one umbrella, the Directorate of National Intelligence, that the CIA and the NSA have been more formally brought under the auspices of the Defense Department. And so then that integration is working to change our national security policy, but also change in the face of the new threats such as terrorism. And there's been, along with adaptation, this transformation of the Defense Department. I mentioned that it began getting smaller at the end of the Cold War. And through the 1990s, there were any number of bases that were shut down. There was a limitation on the number of troops. But it was also during that time that there was this shift towards more elite forces and more technological reliance. And that's something that held over from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration. And one of the reasons that many people argue that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, for example, wanted a smaller number of invasion forces in Iraq was that it was based on this sort of longer term strategy of the Defense Department to become smaller, quicker, so on and so forth, more reliant on special forces, more reliant on technology. And this sort of long-term transformation affected how we formulated our policy in that invasion. Other elements of our national security policy can be seen in historical vantage points. One of the things that has shaped our national security policy for the past few decades has been this focus on the wars of necessity versus the wars of choice. If you face a threat from another nation state or from abroad, it can be necessary that you stand up for yourself, or there can be these perceived threats that are not as vital, but nevertheless you have a choice to engage in them. And two major thinkers in national security policy have pushed our overall national security policy more towards the wars of necessity and away from the wars of choice. And both of these were formulated during the Cold War era, and in a sense in response to the failures of the Vietnam era. One was the Weinberger Doctrine. And this was something that emerged during the Reagan administration. The idea of the Weinberger Doctrine was to only fight wars of necessity to avoid a head-to-head war with the Soviet Union, and only engage in war when it was truly vital to the U.S. or our allies, when they were truly threatened. And thus, sort of this put the Vietnam War as a war of choice, not necessarily a war of necessity. If there had been an invasion of Afghanistan by the United States during the 1980s when the Soviets held it, that would have been a war of choice as well, not necessarily a war of necessity, because even though we would have been challenging the Soviet Union, we would have been putting our own troops on the ground. So you have to have these elements there. There has to be a wholehearted support of committed troops. There has to be clearly defined political and military objectives. There has to be citizen support. That is another hangover from the Vietnam era. The Powell Doctrine is very similar. This is named after Colin Powell, former member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, former Secretary of State. Is the political objective clear? Have you engaged in nonviolent means like diplomacy? Will you be able to realistically achieve your objectives? That is it worth it, the cost-benefit analysis? And so then you have to have all of these things in place, discussed and decided before you engage in a conflict. That is, focusing our policy more than on wars of necessity where we have to fight, rather than on wars of choice where we don't necessarily have to fight.